These three friends were more than just roommates.
They were like brothers.
You could never pull them apart.
They had like an unbreakable bond.
But behind closed doors, trouble was brewing.
That's when the experimenting started.
Doing a certain drug can change people.
And it would boil over in the most horrifying way.
They discovered a shallow grave.
There were repeated blows from blunt force trauma.
There's blood splattered throughout the house.
It's up to detectives to determine what triggered the bloodshed and who's to blame.
He said it was self-defense.
He killed them in cold blood.
There was something deeper, that secret that was being kept from me.
Who do I believe?
It caught me so blindsided how crazy everything got.
June 8th, 2014. It's Sunday afternoon in Shaw, a bustling neighborhood in the heart of Washington, D.C.
It's this neighborhood that's like a lot of neighborhoods in Washington, going through gentrification.
It was definitely the hot spot to be.
There's like a bunch of clubs and like hookah lounges.
The neighborhood's also full of young people. And Bernadette White has come looking for one of them, her 23-year-old grandson, Delano Wingfield.
She was very close to her grandson.
But she hadn't heard from Delano in more than a week, which was unusual.
When she didn't hear from Delano, she went over his house just to see how her grandson was doing.
When she knocks on the door, it isn't her grandson who answers. It's one of his roommates, 21-year-old Jeffrey Neal.
Hey, what are you doing?
Hey, Jeffrey.
Delano lived with Jeffrey and their friend Leon Young.
Have you seen Delano? I've been trying to get a hold of him.
She was starting to get a little concerned.
But what Jeffrey says next does little to ease her fears.
Jeffrey told her that he actually was worried. He hadn't heard from Delano, and neither had Leon.
How long?
Maybe since last weekend.
Last weekend?
Delano Wingfield, Jeffrey Neal, and Leon Young had known each other since their freshman year at DC's McKinley Technical High School.
McKinley Tech attracted some of the most intellectual, talented kids. And these three young men, they were bright.
All three shined academically, but struggled socially.
They may not necessarily fit in with the jocks, with the popular kids.
They were super into anime. They were super into swords, video games. That was their niche, the nerdy fantasy kids.
They kind of lived to a beat of their own drum.
The three friends dubbed themselves the Wolf Pack. Jeffrey was the alpha wolf.
He was very caring. He seemed to want to make sure everyone was enjoying themselves.
Leon was the fun one.
He was very uplifting, like a joy to be around.
He was the one that could make everyone laugh.
And Delano was the quiet one.
He's a very reclusive guy, just like drawing it back and just paying attention to everything.
He was very peaceful, very chill. He was a really sweet person.
Over time, the Wolf Pack became more than friends. They became a family.
They became close. They became brothers.
The families cared about each other. Jeffrey's mom would take the Wolf Pack on ski trips, beach trips. They would share the holidays together.
They were inseparable.
They even figured out a way to remain together after high school, with a generous assist from Jeffrey's grandmother.
When Jeffrey graduated, I don't know why, but his grandmother gave the house to him.
That house had been in their family for years.
We had this whole house to himself, and he let his friends stay there. It was like extra rooms, and they could help pay for rent.
It was a beautiful dynamic for a young male. Honestly, you can get out, be on your own, and be free, and still have the security blanket of, my grandma owns this, so I don't really have to deal with all of the ramifications that come with dealing with the actual landlord and things of that nature. So it was a pretty ideal situation.
It was close to restaurants and shops and food markets and everything outdoors that you wanted to do. It was definitely the hot spot to be.
Once Leon and Delano moved in, the modest townhouse became a full-fledged bachelor pad.
It was pretty like frat type house. From being honest, like, I mean, it was a house of single guys. People were in and out, going to work, coming back. Maybe you're tired, you don't clean up the room or the living room or the kitchen. Like, it happens.
To pay the bills, Jeffrey and his friends found work waiting tables or washing dishes in area restaurants.
None of them seemed interested in like college or anything.
The Wolfpack had other priorities.
Party never stopped.
When you're in that dynamic, 3 guys in their late teens, early 20s, any night could be a party if the right girl or guy calls. It's like, well, can I bring a friend? Or can I bring a friend? And it's 17 people in your house from one phone call.
It was an escape house for all of us. We were still young. We couldn't really go out to like bars and stuff. So whenever I wanted to do something like fun, I would be like, oh, let's go over to Jeffrey's house.
They had girls around all the time. There's a lot of dancing and gaming.
They sit up and play video games all night. They sit up and watch Japanese animation all night.
Always a lot of marijuana and alcohol. Just people coming and going all times of the night.
Jeffrey let me, because we were all artists, draw on the walls of his room. So his room just had all this like graffiti on it. It was cool. It was just like no rules. You could do anything.
But it was this Peter Pan world where they never really had to grow up.
But now one of Neverland's lost boys is truly lost.
They had a relationship where they talked all the time. The grandmother and Delano, they talked frequently. And all of a sudden, she was trying to call him and couldn't get to him.
And according to Jeffrey, he and Leon haven't heard from Delano either.
Do you think something could have happened to him?
I don't know.
Oh, Lord.
She believed something was wrong with her grandson.
She was going to file a missing persons report.
The disappearance of Delano Wingfield will pull back the curtain of a dangerous facade.
There was drama day in and day out.
He had odd behavior and violent behavior.
He had definite anger management issues.
And that became very dangerous.
Since leaving high school, Delano Wingfield, Jeffrey Neal, and Leon Young had been living it up at a Washington, D.C. townhouse.
They turned that house into a party house. If you wanted a good time, you would come over.
We all kind of enjoyed like this freedom we didn't have before. It was pretty wild.
But at the beginning of June 2014, one of the 3 friends, 23-year-old Delano Wingfield, mysteriously disappeared.
Delano's grandmother hadn't heard from him in a long time, and it's just not normal for him.
When she dropped by the house to check on him, his roommate Jeffrey said he hadn't seen Delano in days.
And by June 12th, after another 72 hours with no further word from her grandson or Jeffrey Neal, Delano's grandmother files an official report with police.
There was a missing person report put out by Delano's grandmother.
She wants someone to help find her grandson.
Once the report is filed, officers perform a welfare check at the three friends' townhouse.
No one was home. No one answered the door. Police took a cursory look around. Nothing seemed amiss. So all they could do was just leave a card in the door.
Detectives also reach out to the families of both Jeffrey Neal and Leon Young.
No one they spoke to had any idea where Delano might have been.
However, Jeffrey's mother does give detectives some disturbing information, not about Delano, but about the third roommate, Leon Young.
Jeffrey's mom confessed to police that her son had been having a few issues with Leon.
What sort of issues?
Well, it's just Leon's got problems.
Jeffrey's mom went on to explain that Leon had had some mental issues in the past.
Do you think he's dangerous?
Based on what Jeffrey's told me, yes.
Jeffrey's mom explained to police that Leon could, on many occasions, become enraged and out of control and aggressive.
Leon even pulled a knife on Jeffrey once.
Really?
Leon was the biggest anime fan. Like, he took it all the way. He had like the knives and the swords and stuff.
Leon, in one of these rages, attacked Jeffrey with a knife.
What's your problem, bro? Put the knife down. No.
He went, as you say, just a little bit crazy. And Jeffrey had to end up disarming him.
I kept telling him to stay away from that boy, to kick him out, but Jeffrey would not listen.
To Jeffrey, it was okay. He didn't find anything to be worried about.
Jeffrey did not heed to the advice of his mother to put Leon out because Leon was acting so strange.
In light of this new information, detectives wonder if they're now searching for two lost boys instead of one.
Jeffrey's mom told police that it's been a few days since she heard from Jeffrey.
If you hear from Jeffrey, would you please let him know we are trying to reach him?
Oh, I will.
Jeffrey's mom told the police that she was a little worried herself.
Leon possibly could have harmed her son.
Detectives can't rule out the possibility either.
They definitely had a few red flags raised. Police asked Jeffrey's mom if she has a key to the Shaw residence. She says that she doesn't.
My brother has a key, though.
She said she'd call her brother and ask him to meet detectives at the house.
It's early evening when Jeffrey's uncle arrives at the townhouse.
As soon as he enters the house, he immediately is hit by the worst stench he's ever smelled.
Oh, Lord.
Sickened by the smell, Jeffrey's uncle waits outside for detectives, who arrive a few minutes later.
It smells awful in there.
Sir, would you mind to wait out here, please?
As soon as they're inside, detectives are sure they're dealing with a homicide.
They could tell the smell was coming from the attic. So they pulled down the stairs and they climbed into the attic.
There, hidden underneath an air mattress, detectives find the source of the odor.
There's a dead African-American, naked young man in the attic.
His face was covered in a plastic bag.
But police could not identify whose body it was.
Detectives investigating the disappearance of 23-year-old Delano Wingfield have just found a dead body in the attic of the Washington, D.C. townhouse he shared with roommates Leon Young and Jeffrey Neal.
Detectives weren't sure if it was the missing man.
His face was covered in a plastic bag. He was completely nude.
This dead body looked to have been decomposing for a few days.
In the stifling attic, detectives carefully remove the plastic bag from the victim's head, but are unable to determine his identity.
there was severe blunt trauma to his head.
While the coroner's crew removes the body from the attic, detectives head downstairs.
They began looking for anything that might have linked to what happened in the attic.
They don't have to go far. Inside Leon's bedroom, detectives find a horrific scene.
Blood just everywhere. Obviously, this murder occurred here, in this room.
Detectives find more blood in Jeffrey's room.
Was this an argument and it went from one room to the next?
Finally, detectives find what they believe to be the murder weapon.
They found a bloody hammer. If somebody is wielding a hammer, that means blood is going to be splattering.
Alongside what detectives have learned from Jeffrey's mother, the clues at the scene suggest a possible scenario.
Maybe after Delano's grandmother came to visit, Jeffrey had confronted Leon about the disappearance and things turned violent.
Unsure of the dead man's identity and still unable to contact any of the three roommates, detectives begin digging into Leon's mental health history.
It was found that Leon had just been hospitalized just a few weeks ago.
Leon had been in the psych ward.
There was a diagnosis of him being homicidal in nature.
And not long after his release, Delano disappeared.
Detectives issue an APB for Leon Young.
Police are wondering, did he murder the man that was found in the attic?
Detectives still don't know just whose body was in the attic, but a surprise phone call the next day allows them to rule out one of the roommates.
Police get a call from Jeffrey's mother. She tells them that her son, Jeffrey, is indeed alive, and he wants to talk.
That afternoon, Jeffrey comes into the station.
Detectives sit down with him, and Jeffrey tells them, "I'm glad you've got your notebook."
Why is that? I got a story to tell y'all.
Jeffrey tells police that the body they found in the attic is that of Leon Young.
Leon? How do you know? Because I'm the one that killed him.
He said that it was self-defense.
According to Jeffrey, it had started as they suspected, after Delano's grandmother came by the house looking for him.
And he attacked you? No, not then.
Later that night, he walked past Leon's room. He saw Leon, stark naked, staring out the window.
According to Jeffrey, he was holding a knife, too.
Jeffrey thought he was having a mental health breakdown.
Leon, are you okay?
Jeffrey says when he asked Leon if he was okay, he turned around and blurted out something crazy.
Leon actually yelled to Jeffrey that he killed Delano.
What are you talking about? I killed Delano. I did it.
Jeffrey tried to take the knife.
Listen, man, give me the knife. No, give me the knife, man. Give me the...
According to Jeffrey, Leon lunged at him.
He got me right here.
We showed him where his hand had been cut by Leon.
He just kept coming at me.
Jeffrey knew he had to defend himself.
Jeffrey tells detectives that as he retreated, he noticed a hammer that Leon had left by the door.
When he felt the hammer, he grabbed it, he raised it, he swung it at Leon's head, and it just grazed Leon.
So you hit him again? Well, yeah.
That second time, it hit Leon. It struck him clear in the head, and It was forceful enough that Leon fell to the floor.
He said he hit him twice, 2 or 3 times.
But it was enough.
Leon! Leon!
Jeffrey bent down and shook Leon, and that's when Jeffrey knew Leon was dead.
However, after killing Leon, Jeffrey didn't call the police.
He panicked. It was self-defense, but he believed he had to do some jail time.
The only thing he could think to do was drag Leon's body to the attic.
So you put the bag over his head? Yeah. He was bleeding very, very bad.
But other than that, he was completely naked?
Almost.
Jeffrey told detectives that when Leon confronted him, that he was completely nude except for a pair of socks.
Then, once the body was in the attic, Jeffrey had fled.
He grabbed Leon's keys and he jumped in Leon's car and just hit the highway with no destination.
Jeffrey says that as he drove south alone, he'd eventually come to his senses.
He knew he couldn't just leave his friend in the attic. He turned the car around. He went straight to his mom and asked if his mother could contact the police.
But one question remains.
Why would Leon kill Delano?
Well, it's complicated.
Jeffrey said that the wolf pack weren't just best friends.
There was a love triangle between the boys.
1-year-old Jeffrey Neal has just confessed to killing his roommate, Leon Young, whose body police found in the attic of his Washington, D.C. townhouse.
Jeffrey told the police that he killed Leon in self-defense.
Detectives have also been trying to locate the third person that lived in the house, 23-year-old Delano Wingfield. But Jeffrey's confession sheds light on his disappearance, too.
Jeffrey tells police that he killed Leon. After Leon admitted to killing Delano,
I killed Delano.
According to Jeffrey, the reason Leon supposedly killed Delano is even more jaw-dropping.
According to Jeffrey, there was a love triangle involving all 3 of the roommates.
Jealousy between these 3 lovers led to very hostile feelings.
Jeffrey tells detectives that the 3 friends who'd called themselves the Wolfpack hadn't always been lovers.
The Wolfpack in high school were all platonic. There were never any sexual contact.
But Jeffrey says that after a year of living together under the same roof, his friendship with Leon had evolved.
Well, me and Leon, we was just messing around.
Jeffrey tells police that they never set out to be in a relationship together, that it just grew over time.
I think that Leon probably saw it as a more serious relationship, whereas Jeffrey saw it as a casual thing.
Despite his reservations, Jeffrey says he did little to hide his relationship with Leon.
They would hold hands and walk together at times.
And Delano, what did he think about you and Leon?
He was cool with it.
However, Jeffrey does say that being in a relationship with Leon was a constant struggle.
Jeffrey painted this picture of a man who was struggling with his own mental illness and drug use.
He was angry and he could become aggressive.
Throughout Leon's downward spiral, Jeffrey says he'd stuck by his friend.
He believed in him and he just wanted Leon to be on his meds.
Jeffrey told detectives that Leon wouldn't always take his medication, so he kept getting worse.
It built over time. It was definitely subtle changes. He was not the person that just wanted to see people happy. To me, he wasn't himself anymore.
Jeffrey says that even he couldn't deny it after the incident with the knife.
Leon did pull a knife on Jeffrey, and Jeffrey did, in fact, disarm him.
It just became very, very scary.
After that incident, the relationship between Jeffrey and Leon got strained.
Jeffrey began to distance himself from Leon, and in doing so, that left the door open for him to lean more on Delano.
Eventually, they'd done more than talk.
Delano experimented with him, and they had sex.
Once again, Jeffrey said it was more of a friends with benefits situation.
He probably wasn't very serious about any relationship that went on in that house.
But according to Jeffrey, Leon saw things differently.
Jeffrey! There's always something to tell you. What, man? Calm down. Be cool.
I know what's going on.
Leon was very controlling of Jeffrey. He didn't want Delano hanging out with his lover, Jeffrey.
Does that explain Delano's disappearance?
They had already found out about Leon's history of mental illness, and everything seemed to check out just as Jeffrey had said.
However, there are a few things about Jeffrey's story that don't quite add up for detectives.
They couldn't understand why there was blood in Jeffrey's bedroom.
Although, considering all of the blood in Leon's room, it was quite possible that Jeffrey had tracked it into his own room.
Jeffrey's description of Leon's body is also puzzling.
Jeffrey mentioned that Leon had been wearing socks, but when detectives found his body in the attic, he was barefoot.
For the moment, detectives are willing to overlook the inconsistencies.
Remember, this is a 21-year-old kid, and it just killed one of his best friends.
Everything seems, in their eyes, legit.
So that was enough for the police to let him go.
Really? I can go.
We'll be in touch.
And if you hear anything about Delano, you'll let me know, right?
He was very concerned. Delano wasn't just his friend. Delano was also Jeffrey's lover.
You'll be one of the first people we contact.
But when detectives follow up with the Wolfpack's friends, they'll discover a secret about Jeffrey he'd rather have kept hidden.
Leon wasn't the only one in the group who'd lashed out in anger before.
No one ever suspected that either of them would have turned on the other.
He hit him and kept punching him.
24 hours after police discovered Leon Young's bludgeoned body, his roommate and lover, Jeffrey Neal, has just confessed to killing Leon in self-defense.
Jeffrey told authorities that Leon came at him with a knife.
However, what happened to Jeffrey's other roommate and lover, 23-year-old Delano Wingfield, is less certain.
Jeffrey told detectives that Leon confessed to killing Delano shortly before his death.
Leon was jealous of this relationship that Jeffrey was also having with Delano.
Given Leon's history of mental illness, detectives suspect Jeffrey may be right.
You free to go?
He had been let go after the initial interview by the police.
The next morning, hoping to corroborate what Jeffrey told them, detectives begin the grim task of reaching out to the trio's friends who were shocked by the news of Leon's death.
I didn't know what to think. It was devastating.
They were like close friends. I never seen that coming.
For some, the love triangle between the roommates is just as much of a shock.
I didn't know that they had a sexual relationship.
However, other friends aren't so surprised.
I picked up hints that they might have been, more than friends.
One friend actually walked in on Leon and Jeffrey having sex.
All of the trio's friends do share stories of Leon's odd behavior.
Leon was doing weird things like painting the wall black in his bedroom.
I, witnessed the knife marks in the walls.
He was high-strung, easily irritated, easily agitated.
Friends tell detectives that Leon's drug use included PCP and only added to his instability.
PCP was one of the drugs that Leon allegedly used.
It made him different, made him lash out. Doing a certain drug can change, your brain chemistry or your mood.
Friends had also seen signs of Leon's aggression toward Jeffrey.
When I saw Jeffrey, he had, a black eye, apparently from Leon lashing out on him.
Another friend confirms Jeffrey's account of the previous incident, where Leon had come at Jeffrey with a knife.
He did see this one time when Leon pulled a knife on Jeffrey and tried to attack him.
Jeffrey was able to get the knife off of Leon.
However, the friend adds a new detail that Jeffrey had left out.
Leon was subdued, and Jeffrey at that point just went off on him, and he started wailing on him.
He hit him and kept punching him.
According to some friends, the love triangle wasn't the only source of tension in the wolf pack.
When you live with someone, even though you love them, things start to bother you. Jeffrey, since he ran the house, felt like he wasn't being respected. People were trashing the house.
At the same time, Delano and Leon were often just as frustrated with Jeffrey.
So they were paying Jeffrey rent, but Jeffrey wasn't using the money to pay the bills. There was often times when, unfortunately, the utilities were cut off, and that was a source of frustration.
And the romantic tension between the three friends only turned up the heat.
You could tell that, this could get very bad. This could turn dark.
Tensions in the house had just gotten to a boiling point.
In fact, friends tell detectives that by the end of May, the wolf pack was on the verge of splitting up for good.
Last that I heard from Leon, he wanted to get his own place and just be independent.
Leon essentially felt like he could do better off by himself.
Friends say that Delano was also looking for an exit.
I'm not sure which direction he planned on going, but I know that it was a better one than being in Jeff's house.
Delano did not want to continue that lifestyle. Just wanted to move on with his life.
After years of being the leader of the pack, Jeffrey was about to be the lone wolf.
Which left detectives wondering, could their potential plans to exit the wolf pack have played some role in Leon's death and in Delano's disappearance?
Even more questions arise when detectives get the results of Leon's autopsy.
The medical examiner confirmed that the body was indeed Leon's.
However, little else in the report backs up Jeffrey's story.
Jeffrey had told the police that he had struck Leon Young 2 to 3 times.
The medical examiner report showed that Leon had been struck in the head with a hammer as many as 25 to 30 times.
Detectives already had reports from friends about an incident where Leon had attacked Jeffrey with a knife. And Jeffrey managed to wrestle the knife away from Leon, but he still continued to punch him repeatedly.
Was it possible things had gotten similarly out of hand? Not according to the autopsy.
According to the medical examiner, Jeffrey likely killed Leon while he was sleeping.
Hitting someone as many as 30 times is not self-defense. That's murder.
But is Leon Jeffrey's only victim? On the morning of June 16th, detectives returned to the townhouse in Shaw.
While they are searching the house, in the backyard, they discover a shallow grave.
They find who they believe to be Delano Wingfield. There's blunt force trauma to the head, very similar to Leon's body.
But unlike Leon, Delano isn't entirely naked.
He was wearing socks.
And the police were like, wait a minute. He talked about Leon having on socks, but it turned out that Delano had on socks.
On June 16, 2014, 4 days after police found Leon Young dead inside the Washington, D.C. townhouse he shared with Delano Wingfield and Jeffrey Neal, detectives have just made another gruesome discovery.
They find in a shallow grave in the backyard another young man's body.
Dental records confirm that the body is Delano, and the autopsy suggests he's been dead for some time.
Delano was killed 2 weeks before Leon.
Detectives believe Delano's cause of death may also suggest his killer's identity.
He died pretty much in the same fashion as Leon, with blunt force trauma to the head.
He, too, had been hit repeatedly, between 20 to 30 times.
But for detectives, the biggest red flag is a simple pair of socks.
When police found Delano's body, he was nude, but he was wearing socks.
Jeffrey told the detectives that when he killed Leon, Leon was wearing socks. So Leon's body was barefoot.
Had Jeffrey committed both murders and actually made the mistake of forgetting who wore the socks and who didn't?
That was enough for the police to charge him to both murders.
When detectives officially charged Jeffrey with both murders on June 17th, the news divides the Wolfpack's friends and families.
I don't know his reasoning, but from what I can gather, it had to be that. It had to be the lover scorn. I don't want this situation to change. He didn't want to lose that, and he was willing to kill for it.
Others remain convinced that Leon was the real danger.
From what I know about Leon, it's easy for me to believe Jeffrey.
When Jeffrey goes on trial in July of 2017, the prosecution downplays the fact that the three friends were also lovers.
Prosecutors decided to gloss over the whole love triangle.
Instead, the prosecution focuses on Jeffrey's role as leader of the Wolfpack.
It was Jeffrey's house, and so Jeffrey wanted to keep that control over his roommates. And what he was seeing was that his roommates were beginning to take control of their own lives.
But according to the prosecution, Jeffrey saw his friend's growth as an act of betrayal.
Jeffrey didn't want anybody to outgrow him or to leave a position where they were dependent on Jeffrey.
Leon and Delano was basically pulling away from this friendship. That's what prosecutors are saying drove Jeffrey into this violent rage.
Based on his autopsy, prosecutors believe Delano was Jeffrey's first victim.
Jeffrey killed Delano sometime near the end of May, although the exact circumstances weren't entirely clear.
It had to be a rage. It had to be like it's a blackout fit of rage.
After the murder, Jeffrey buried Delano's body in the backyard before cleaning up the crime scene.
Based on the DNA testing of the blood found inside the house, the prosecutors believed that Delano died in Jeffrey's room.
Jeffrey may have missed some blood, but prosecutors believe several days passed before Leon became suspicious.
When Leon started asking questions about Delano, he knew he had to do something.
He had to keep Leon from talking.
Jeffrey waited until Leon was asleep. He came in his room and he killed him in cold blood.
Then he'd stashed Leon's body in the attic and gone on the run.
The prosecutors theorized that once Jeffrey's money ran out, he ran back home and decided to bluff his way through this, claiming self-defense.
The things in the police interview, when he downplayed the number of times that he hit Leon, would seem to come back to haunt him at trial.
On top of Jeffrey's lies, the prosecution says the detail of Delano's socks suggests that Jeffrey also couldn't keep his murder straight.
Prosecution basically said that Jeffrey mixed up the two.
When it's the defense's turn, they claim that Leon is the true villain of this story.
The defense was that these two murders happened as a result of Leon in a jealous rage, that he is the one who killed Delano.
And according to the defense, Jeffrey was lucky not to suffer the same fate.
We believe that Leon attacked Jeffrey consistent with his odd behavior and violent behavior that he exhibited for years.
The defense said if he had not fought back, he would have been killed by Leon just as Leon killed Delano.
We talked about Leon's erratic behavior and mental health episodes.
But will that be enough to sway the jury?
They found Jeffrey Neal guilty of murder of both Leon and Delano. And he was eventually sentenced to more than 60 years in prison.
Today, the Wolfpack's friends remain divided on whether Jeffrey got what he deserved.
Honestly, justice doesn't tend to work a lot of times. So for justice to actually prevail this time, I do appreciate that.
I feel like they didn't really give his defense a chance. I feel like they just wanted to lock someone up for what happened to Delano, and they couldn't do it with Leon, so they did it to Jeffrey.
But no matter which side they believe, one thing is true. The
year is 1974, a time of disco, long hair, and an insidious, quiet darkness that swallowed the small town of Blackwood Creek whole on a sweltering July evening. It began with a bicycle, found abandoned in a ditch off Route 9, its front wheel still spinning lazily in the humid breeze. Its owner, 12-year-old Emily Vance, was gone. Just gone. The silence that followed wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was a physical weight that descended upon the town, suffocating the laughter, drying up the smiles, and turning neighbors into strangers overnight. You look at the grainy black and white photographs from the original crime scene, the tall, yellowed grass, the lonely road, the haunting emptiness of the frame, and you can almost feel the chill that defied the midsummer heat. The search parties, organized in a frantic, desperate blur of flashlights and weeping volunteers, combed every inch of those woods, but the forest kept its secrets with a cold, iron grip. No body, no struggle, no motive. Just a void where a life had been, a hole in the community that would never truly heal. For 50 years, the Vance case remained the ultimate enigma, a cold case that haunted the dreams of the local police and served as the dark heartbeat of a town that tried to forget, but never could. And then, the earth finally spoke. A construction crew working on the expansion of the interstate, tearing through a long-abandoned plot of land near the old Miller farm, hit something that wasn't bedrock. It was a concrete slab, buried 6 feet deep, a silent, subterranean vault designed to hold something away from the light of day. When the forensic teams arrived, their white suits stark against the encroaching dusk, they didn't just find remnants of a long-ago tragedy. They found the shattered remains of 2 lives, hidden together in a grave that time had almost erased. The shockwaves hit Blackwood Creek with the force of a tectonic shift, a sudden, violent tearing away of the veil that had covered the truth for half a century. People who had long since moved on, who had built lives on the foundation of a mystery, suddenly found themselves staring into the hollow, accusing eyes of the past. It wasn't just one victim, it was 2. The identity of the second body, a young drifter who had vanished weeks after Emily, sent the investigation spiraling into uncharted, terrifying territory. The police, led by a task force that felt the heavy, spectral pressure of every detective who had failed before them, moved with a surgical, ruthless efficiency. They didn't look for drifters or strangers this time. They looked at the names that had been whispered behind closed doors for decades, the names that had been protected by the town's own desire for normalcy. They found the link, a fragile, rusted thread that connected the high society of Blackwood Creek to the darkest, most depraved corners of human desire. When the warrant was finally served on the elegant, sprawling estate of the town's former mayor, the image of his arrest, a frail, silver-haired man being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of stone, was splashed across every screen in the nation. Then came the second arrest, a surprise that rattled the very bedrock of the local faith. The town's beloved librarian, a woman who had read stories to generations of children, now handcuffed and led into the dark belly of a police cruiser. The town watched, breathless, horrified, unable to reconcile the faces they knew with the monsters the evidence was revealing. The investigation into the Miller property transformed into a forensic excavation of a hidden, parallel world that had existed beneath the town's surface for decades. Every floorboard pulled up, every wall tapped, revealed a new layer of the deception. Hidden compartments, journals filled with meticulous, terrifying observations of potential targets, and trinkets that dated back to the mid-70s, preserved like specimens in a perverse collector's museum. The lead detective, a man who had grown up in the town and had once played with Emily Vance in the schoolyard, moved through the house with a mix of professional detachment and personal, burning rage. He found a ledger, leather-bound and fragile, that wasn't just a list, it was a manifesto. It detailed the selection process, the way the mayor and the librarian had worked in tandem, one using his political influence to silence witnesses and redirect police investigations, the other using her position of trust to identify the vulnerable, the alone, and the forgotten. They hadn't just murdered. They had curated, viewing the town as their own private hunting ground, a place where their appetites could be sated without ever casting a shadow on their impeccable public personas. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was enough to drain the color from the faces of the most hardened investigators. They discovered that Emily Vance hadn't been an anomaly. She had been the first, a trophy, the catalyst for a partnership built on a shared, dark fascination. The librarian had spent her days recommending books to young girls, all the while taking notes on their daily routines, their habits, the paths they walked to school, passing that information to the mayor like a tactical scout. The realization that their own community leaders had been the architects of their worst nightmares made the people of Blackwood Creek feel like they were living in an episode of a dark, twisted fiction. The suspicion started to rot the town from the inside out. People stopped trusting the school board. They questioned the motives of their local officials, and they started to wonder about the accidents and disappearances that had occurred in the decades since the Vance case went cold. They were realizing that the silence that had ruled the town for 50 years hadn't been an accident. It had been a managed, protected, and enforced condition. As the legal proceedings began, the courtroom became a theater of the grotesque, a place where the secrets of the dead were finally forced into the light. The prosecution laid out a timeline that was as precise as it was damning, mapping the victims to the movements of the suspects with a terrifying, undeniable logic. The mayor, whose career had been built on the promise of law and order, was shown to be the man who had personally signed the orders to close the Vance investigation, his pen stroke effectively burying the evidence that would have linked him to the scene. The librarian, once seen as the town's moral compass, was revealed to be the one who had written the anonymous letters to the police, deliberately leading them toward false leads and away from the truth. The courtroom gallery, filled with the descendants of the victims and the shaken residents of Blackwood Creek, sat in a state of stunned, numb disbelief as the details of the culling were read aloud. They heard about the basement of the Miller farm, the way it had been soundproofed with industrial foam and reinforced with steel, a place designed to extinguish the very concept of hope. They heard about the game, the way the two monsters had competed to see who could identify the most unmissable target, a grotesque contest that had turned human lives into pieces on a board. The defense, desperate and out of options, tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the passage of time had tainted the samples, but the DNA evidence, reclaimed from the soil of that long-forgotten grave, was absolute. It linked the victims to the suspects with a certainty that no lawyer could ever argue away. The faces of the defendants during the trial were a study in detachment. The mayor sat with his eyes closed, his breathing slow and rhythmic, as if he were simply enduring a tedious board meeting, while the librarian stared at the ceiling, her expression unreadable, almost bored. It was this lack of remorse, this utter, total absence of humanity, that hurt the town more than any confession ever could. The impact on the families of the victims was a slow, agonizing process of reclamation. For 50 years, they had lived with the weight of the cold case, the uncertainty that had poisoned their joy, the grief that had been forced to remain unspoken because there was no body, no evidence, no resolution. Now they had the truth, but the truth was a jagged, piercing blade. They had to confront the reality that their daughters, their sisters, their friends hadn't just been the victims of a random tragedy. They had been the prey of people who had been invited into their homes, people who had shaken their hands, people who had offered them comfort and condolences. The betrayal was total. It wasn't just a murder case. It was a violation of the very idea of community. In the weeks after the verdict, you could see the change in the town, the way people walked with their heads down, the way the storefronts looked smaller, the way the silence had returned. But this time, it was a silence of profound, shaken introspection. The town was no longer a place of innocent, small-town charm. It was a crime scene, a graveyard, a cautionary tale. The investigators, having done their job, began to pack up their evidence, but they knew they were leaving behind a town that would never be the same again. They had solved the cold case. They had put the monsters in chains, but the damage was done. The ghosts of the past were no longer confined to the shadows. They were walking in the daylight, and the town would have to find a way to live with them, or perish beneath the weight of their own memories. The fallout of the trial began to spread, reaching far beyond the borders of Blackwood Creek. Other law enforcement agencies, inspired by the success of the task force, began to reopen their own cold cases, looking back at their own histories with a new, suspicious eye. They started to question the unsolved disappearances in their own towns, searching for the patterns, the connections, and the hidden agendas that had been ignored in favor of convenience and silence. The Oakhaven case had set a new precedent. It had proven that the truth is never truly buried, that time is not a deterrent to justice, and that even the most well-hidden monsters can be brought into the light if you have the patience and the will to look. But for the people of Blackwood Creek, the broader lessons were cold comfort. They were left with the reality of their own history, a history that was now indelibly stained by the actions of two people they had once trusted. The vacant lot where the Miller farm once stood remained empty, a scar on the land that no one wanted to look at, let alone build upon. It was a place of memory, a place of loss, and a place of a truth so heavy that it seemed to depress the very soil. As the years began to turn, the story of the long-buried 1970s cold case started to take on the characteristics of a local legend. The gruesome details were softened by time, the anger was mitigated by the distance, and the town began to settle into a new, albeit fragile, sense of normalcy. The events that had once been a source of constant, visceral terror were now the subject of quiet, late-night contemplation. The town was moving forward, not by erasing the past, but by integrating it into their present. The horror of the mayor and the librarian's actions was now a part of the town's narrative, a reminder of the darkness that can exist and the strength it takes to face it. They built a memorial in the park, a simple fountain with the names of the victims etched into the stone, a place where people could come to sit and think and find a moment of peace. It was a beautiful, tranquil space where the sound of running water drowned out the echoes of the past, but even there, in the heart of the community, the shadow remained, a subtle, persistent reminder of the darkness that had once been their own. Detective Miller, the man who had led the task force and had seen the case through to its bitter end, retired to a small, quiet life in the next state, but he never truly left Blackwood Creek behind. He spent his nights reading the case files, studying the maps, and trying to understand the why, the deep, inscrutable, and fundamentally broken logic that had driven two people to turn their lives into a campaign of terror. He found no easy answers, no satisfying explanation, no relief from the burden of the truth. He understood that the real lesson of the case was not about the power of justice, but about the fragile, tenuous nature of trust. He knew that the greatest danger is often the one that looks the most normal, the one that smiles, the one that serves on the school board, the one that holds the keys to the library. He knew that the monsters don't live in the woods. They live in our houses, they walk our streets, and they sit at our tables. And that realization, more than anything, was what had changed his life, and what had changed the life of the town forever. The community of Blackwood Creek had survived the horror, had faced the truth, and had emerged on the other side, changed, scarred, but intact. They had lost, they had suffered, and they had been forever altered. But they had also found a way to move forward, to hold on to their lives, and to continue to exist in a world that was as beautiful as it was dangerous, as bright as it was dark. They were a community that had learned the hard way that the world is not always what it seems, and that the greatest strength we have is in each other, and in our willingness to look at the world, and at ourselves with a clear and an honest eye. They were, in the end, the ones who had survived, and they were, in the end, the ones who had found their way back to the light. The cold, the dark, the fear, it was all behind them, a part of the history they had lived, and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And so, the story continued, as all stories do, in the hearts and minds of those who lived it. The town of Blackwood Creek would never be the same, but it was alive, vibrant, and moving forward, holding on to the truth as a shield against any darkness that might ever dare to return. The finality of the case was both a relief and a promise that they would never again let the secret stay buried, never again let the neighbor remain a stranger, and never again let the silence win. The case was closed, the story was told, and the town of Blackwood Creek was, at last, truly home again. The investigation, meanwhile, had had a ripple effect far beyond the borders of the town. It changed the way missing persons cases were handled across the entire state. The Miller Protocol, as it came to be known, emphasized the importance of looking at the immediate social circle, the peripheral figures, and the normal people who were often overlooked by investigators who were looking for a criminal type. It encouraged a more granular approach to investigation, a deeper dive into the mundane aspects of a suspect's life. It was a shift from looking for the stranger to looking for the secret. The impact of this shift was immediate. Cold cases that had been stalled for years began to show movement. Connections were made, were connected, and secrets that had been hidden for decades were finally brought to light. The long-buried 1970s cold case had not just solved a single tragedy, it had provided a blueprint for solving many, many more. It was a legacy of light, a way to ensure that the work of the investigators who had struggled for so long was not in vain. And as the story came to a close, the final image was one of peace. The memorial fountain, the children playing in the sun, the community coming together to remember, to heal, and to move on. It was a picture of a world that was finally, and at last, at rest. The horror was gone, the truth was out, and the people of Blackwood Creek were, once again, the masters of their own lives. They were, in the end, the ones who had survived, and they were, in the end, the ones who had found their way back to the light. The cold, the dark, the fear, it was all behind them, a part of the history they had lived, and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And so, the story of the frozen cold case, of the girl who had vanished, the monster who had lived right next door, and the community that had survived, reached its final, quiet, and triumphant conclusion. The cold had finally lifted, the ice had finally broken, and the world was beginning to breathe again. The shockwave of the double arrest did not dissolve with the morning dew. It hardened into an icy reality that choked the very breath out of Blackwood Creek. The media trucks arrived like a vanguard of metallic locusts, clogging the narrow, historic streets, their satellite dishes pointing toward the gray sky like metallic fingers accusing the town of harboring a multi-decade horror. On every national broadcast, the images looped relentlessly. The former mayor, a man who had once been the literal face of prosperity, and the librarian, whose quiet, spectacled countenance had graced every town council meeting for 40 years, both bound in steel, their eyes cast downward, refusing to acknowledge the cameras. The community stood behind police barricades, a fractured collective, looking at the familiar brick facades of their downtown with a profound, dizzying sense of vertigo. Beneath the asphalt of Route 9, where the construction crew had unearthed the concrete vault, the forensic investigation deepened into a multi-layered exhumation. The state crime lab erected a massive, climate-controlled tent over the site, sealing it away from the prying eyes of the public, but the leaks from the investigation could not be contained. Rumors swept through the local diners and church pews like wildfire. They hadn't just found bones, they had found an archive. The initial discovery of Emily Vance and the unidentified young drifter was merely the threshold of a larger, more meticulous graveyard. The soil beneath the concrete slab was stratified with secrets, containing fragments of clothing, forgotten accessories, and personal effects that didn't match either of the two initial victims. The investigators worked in pairs, utilizing fine brushes and dental picks, uncovering the evidence with a slow, agonizing precision that mirrored the clinical nature of the crimes themselves. As the state police began to dismantle the interior of the former mayor's estate, a sprawling colonial property that sat on a hill overlooking the valley, the true architecture of the conspiracy began to emerge. The house, pristine on the outside with its white columns and manicured hedges, held a secret cellar system that bypassed the modern blueprint of the home. Access was hidden behind a massive, built-in mahogany bookshelf in the study, a room where political strategies had been mapped out and town ordinances had been signed into law. When the technicians engaged the hidden hydraulic release, the shelf swung inward to reveal a damp, concrete staircase descending into a darkness that smelled of rot, old copper, and 30 years of stagnant air. At the bottom of those stairs lay a chamber that looked less like a dungeon and more like a macabre administrative office. There were no chains on the walls, no theatrical instruments of torture. Instead, there were filing cabinets, steel desks, and high-intensity industrial lamps. It was a workspace. The investigators found rows of binders, color-coded by decade, containing thousands of pages of typewritten logs, surveillance notes, and psychological assessments of young girls and vulnerable individuals who had passed through the town since 1972. The mayor and the librarian had kept records with the cold, bureaucratic detachment of insurance adjusters, cataloging the daily habits, family structures, and specific vulnerabilities of their targets. The logs revealed a chilling division of labor that defied the town's comprehension. The librarian had used her position of unquestioned trust to act as the intelligence gatherer. She kept meticulous notes on which children walked home alone, which families were distracted by marital strife or financial ruin, and which young drifters stepped off the Greyhound bus looking for a fresh start. She would invite these individuals into the quiet corners of the library, offering them tea, listening to their problems, and extracting the very details that would later be used to orchestrate their disappearance. Once a target was selected, the profile was passed to the mayor, who utilized his executive authority over the local police department to ensure that patrol routes were altered, security cameras were down for maintenance, and subsequent missing person reports were systematically mismanaged or filed away as runaways. The lead investigator, whose own childhood memories were intertwined with the very streets these predators patrolled, sat in the mobile command unit, turning the pages of the ledger with gloved hands. His eyes scanned the precise, elegant handwriting of the librarian, juxtaposed against the sharp, aggressive typewritten notes of the mayor. They had developed a shorthand code to describe their victims, referring to them as assets or acquisitions. The timeline cracked open a series of cold cases that had long been written off by the county as unrelated tragedies. A teenage runaway from 1978, a young mechanic who vanished in 1983, a college student whose car was found abandoned by the river in 1991. All of them were documented within these binders, their final hours recorded with an unholy level of detail. The realization of this multi-decade operation struck the local precinct with a paralyzing sense of guilt. The older officers, some now retired but brought back for questioning, had to confront the reality that they had been pawns in a game designed by their highest superior. Every time they had been ordered to cease a search, every time an investigation was redirected toward an innocent drifter or a grieving family member, it hadn't been administrative incompetence. It had been a calculated strategy to protect the hunting ground. The files contained explicit instructions from the mayor's office, detailing how to handle the press, what information to withhold from the public, and how to gently pressure the Vance family into accepting that Emily was gone forever. The town's psychological fracture widened as the search extended to the public library itself. The historic building, funded by the mayor's family foundation, was locked down with yellow crime scene tape. Forensics teams swarmed the basement archives, prying open floorboards beneath the local history section. There, hidden among 19th-century land deeds and old town maps, they discovered a secondary collection of trophies, small items that had belonged to the missing. A silver charm bracelet, a high school class ring, a water-stained diary, and a collection of Polaroid photographs taken from distances that suggested long-term stalking. The library, which had been the cultural heart of Blackwood Creek, a place where parents dropped off their children after school without a second thought, was revealed to be the staging ground for an unprecedented campaign of predation. The public reaction shifted from collective numbness to an explosive, volatile rage. Protesters gathered outside the county jail where the two defendants were being held in administrative segregation, their voices rising in a unified, guttural roar that echoed through the brick canyons of the town center. The rage was fueled by a profound sense of violation. These weren't outsiders who had breached the perimeter of their safe community. These were the caretakers, the people who had been entrusted with the safety of their children, the administration of their laws, and the preservation of their history, had been systematically harvesting their youth for 30 years. The sense of betrayal was so absolute that it paralyzed the daily functions of the town. Businesses remained closed, the local government was placed under state receivership, and the streets grew silent after dusk, as if the old fear from 1974 had broken its chains and retaken the night. Inside the interrogation rooms, the dynamic between the detectives and the suspects was a psychological chess match played out under the cold glare of fluorescent lights. The former mayor sat with his hands cuffed to the table, his posture rigid, his face an impenetrable mask of aristocratic defiance. He refused to speak without his high-priced legal team present, but his eyes followed every movement of the investigators, his jaw tightening slightly whenever they brought in a new box of evidence from his estate. He was a man who had spent his life controlling the narrative, and even in chains, he was attempting to maintain his composure through absolute silence. The librarian, however, presented a far more complex and terrifying puzzle. She sat in her cell with a serene, almost detached calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When the detectives presented her with the logs recovered from the library basement, she didn't deny her handwriting. Instead, she adjusted her glasses, leaned forward, and spoke with the measured, educational tone of a schoolmistress. She described the victims not with malice, but with a horrifying lack of empathy, explaining that she had merely been an observer of a natural process. To her, the town was a microcosm of a larger, colder universe where the weak were destined to be absorbed by those who possess the intelligence and the power to remain unseen. "You look at us and see monsters," she whispered, her voice steady and devoid of tremor. "But we were the architecture that kept this town stable. We gave you the illusion of safety for 50 years. We managed the darkness so that you could sleep at night. If we hadn't controlled it, if we hadn't selected the targets with precision, the chaos would have swallowed this valley decades ago. We didn't destroy Blackwood Creek, we preserved it." The cold, philosophical justification of her crimes sent a physical shudder through the observation room. The detectives realized that they weren't dealing with a sudden psychological break or a crime of passion. They were dealing with a deeply ingrained, shared delusion that had been nurtured over half a century. The partnership between the political power of the mayor and the analytical intelligence of the librarian had created a closed-loop system that was nearly impervious to traditional police work. It had taken a literal excavation of the earth, an accidental strike by a construction crew, to break the circuit. The legal strategy for the prosecution began to take shape as a monumental task of consolidation. The state attorney general took personal command of the case, recognizing that a standard trial would not suffice for a crime of this magnitude. They had to build a case that would withstand the inevitable onslaught of appeals from the defense, ensuring that every piece of physical evidence, every DNA match, and every page of the recovered ledgers was tied down with absolute forensic certainty. The team worked around the clock in the basement of the Capitol building, creating a massive digital matrix that mapped the movements of the suspects to the exact dates and times of over a dozen unsolved disappearances across 3 counties. The scale of the case required the invocation of specialized federal statutes, transforming the investigation from a local homicide case into a comprehensive prosecution for civil rights violations, kidnapping conspiracy, and institutional corruption. The indictment, when it was finally drafted, was a document that weighed several pounds, a literal chronicle of a town's victimization that read like a historical ledger of horror. The state was preparing for a legal battle that would redefine the boundaries of criminal law, forcing the court to confront a conspiracy that had successfully subverted the mechanisms of justice for an entire generation. As the winter frost began to settle over the valley, turning the mud of the interstate excavation site into a hard, unforgiving crust, the physical reality of the crime scene remained a dominant feature of the landscape. The massive white tent still stood off Route 9, illuminated by floodlights that burned through the long, freezing nights. The state police maintained a permanent perimeter, keeping back the true crime enthusiasts, the independent journalists, and the local residents who came simply to stare at the spot where the 50-year silence had finally been broken. The ground had given up its dead, but the air remained thick with the unanswered questions of those who were left behind, a community standing on the precipice of a revelation that would either cleanse them or destroy them completely. The cold that gripped Blackwood Creek that winter was not just a meteorological condition, it was a psychological frost that seeped through the floorboards of every home, settling deep into the bones of a population that had forgotten how to look each other in the eye. The yellow crime scene tape that wrapped around the public library didn't just cordon off a building, it split the town's history in half. There was the time before the thaw, the decades when parents told their children that Emily Vance had simply been taken by a passing stranger, a tragic anomaly in an otherwise pristine valley, and the time after, where the truth sat like a heavy, suffocating weight on the chest of every resident. Every interaction, every memory of a town picnic, a library fundraiser, or a political rally was now reevaluated through a lens of profound suspicion. Inside the temporary headquarters established at the State Police Barracks, the investigation took on a rhythmic, exhausting intensity. The walls of the war room were entirely covered in a massive, sprawling timeline that stretched from 1970 to the present day. Red threads connected the names of over 15 missing individuals to the property records, travel schedules, and official appointments of the former mayor and the librarian. The digital matrix developed by the state's forensic analysts was beginning to hum with terrifying clarity. It showed that whenever the mayor attended an out-of-town municipal conference, a corresponding anomaly appeared in the missing persons database of the surrounding counties. It showed that the librarian's orders for specific, rare historical texts often coincided with periods when she was conducting deep, off-the-books research into families that had recently moved to the area. The excavation at the interstate expansion site off Route 9 had moved past the initial concrete slab. The ground, hardened by the freezing temperatures, had to be thawed using industrial heaters before the archaeological team could proceed. What they found beneath the secondary layer of soil was a meticulously engineered drainage system designed to prevent the accumulation of moisture that might cause the ground above to sink or shift. This wasn't the work of a panicked killer hiding a body in the dark. It was a civil engineering project executed with calculation. The soil samples analyzed by the State University's Geology Department revealed traces of lime and specific chemical compounds used to accelerate the decomposition of organic matter, mixed with a highly specialized industrial sealant that had kept the scent of decay from reaching the surface or attracting the tracking dogs used in the original 1974 search parties. As the physical evidence mounted, the financial audit of the mayor's family foundation opened an entirely separate front in the investigation. Forensic accountants from the state attorney general's office spent weeks tracing a labyrinth of offshore accounts, shell companies, and real estate transactions that dated back to the mid-70s. They discovered that the foundation, ostensibly created to fund local literacy programs and historical preservation projects, had been used to acquire isolated parcels of land throughout the state, parcels that were never developed, never rented, and remained entirely hidden behind layers of legal anonymity. One such property, an abandoned logging camp 3 hours north of Blackwood Creek, became the subject of an immediate federal search warrant. When the state police tactical unit breached the perimeter of that northern logging camp, they found a mirror image of the subterranean bunker discovered beneath the mayor's estate. It was a secondary facility, built inside a reinforced bunker that had been dug into the side of a granite ridge. The air inside was frigid, smelling of ozone and old canvas. Here, the investigators found the true scale of the logistics required to maintain a multi-decade conspiracy. There were survival supplies, medical equipment, and communication arrays that suggested the suspects had prepared for every possible contingency, including a total breakdown of social order. But the most disturbing discovery was a small, functional darkroom, its clotheslines still holding the faded, chemical-stained negatives of photographs taken over a 30-year span. These weren't just surveillance photos. They were the documentation of a process, a visual record of lives being systematically disassembled. The lead detective, standing in the center of that darkroom under the amber glow of a safety lamp, realized that the conspiracy had thrived because it was entirely self-contained. The mayor possessed the political immunity and the logistical resources, while the librarian possessed the analytical methodology. They had created an intelligence apparatus within a small town, utilizing the tools of civil administration to map, track, and erase human beings with the efficiency of a corporate enterprise. The detective looked at a series of developed prints that showed the perimeter of the Vance home from 1974, photos taken from the tree line, detailing the exact moments the parents left for work, the precise time Emily arrived home from school, and the blind spots in the neighbors' lines of sight. It was a military-grade reconnaissance operation conducted against a 12-year-old girl. Back in Blackwood Creek, the social fabric of the community was tearing along political and generational lines. The younger residents, who had only known the mayor as a distant, silver-haired figure of local history, demanded a total cleansing of the town's institutions. They protested outside the town hall, calling for the resignation of the entire city council, arguing that the corruption could not have been contained to just 2 individuals. The older generation, however, was paralyzed by a deeper, more intimate horror. These were people who had gone to high school with the mayor, who had shared coffee with him at the local diner, who had trusted the librarian with their grandchildren's education. To accept the reality of the evidence was to accept that their entire lives had been lived in the shadow of an absolute, calculated lie. The defense attorneys for the suspects began their preliminary legal counteroffensive, filing a massive motion to suppress the evidence gathered from the interstate expansion site. They argued that the original discovery by the construction crew was an illegal trespass on private property, that the chain of custody for the forensic samples had been compromised by the heavy machinery, and that the 50-year gap between the alleged crimes and the collection of the DNA evidence rendered the laboratory results inherently unreliable. They sought to split the trial, demanding separate proceedings for the mayor and the librarian, a tactical move designed to force the prosecution to reveal their strategy and to prevent the jury from seeing the full, combined weight of the conspiracy. The prosecution, however, remained resolute. The state attorney general filed a comprehensive brief under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act, arguing that the suspects had operated a continuous, ongoing criminal enterprise that utilized the instruments of local government to facilitate kidnapping, murder, and the obstruction of justice. By framing the case as an enterprise, the state could introduce evidence from every decade of the operation, linking the 1974 disappearance of Emily Vance directly to the financial fraud discovered in the 2000s. It was a legal strategy designed to prevent the defense from isolating the individual crimes, forcing the court to view the narrative as a singular, unbroken line of institutional terror. The psychological evaluation of the suspects, conducted by a panel of state-appointed psychiatrists, provided a window into a shared pathology that was as clinical as it was grotesque. The reports described the relationship between the mayor and the librarian not as a traditional criminal partnership, but as a highly functional, symbiotic system driven by an extreme need for control and a profound contempt for the community they served. The mayor, characterized by an intense narcissistic personality structure, viewed the town as his personal property, a realm where his authority was absolute and above the laws of ordinary men. The librarian, diagnosed with a severe, detached schizoid presentation, found her gratification in the intellectual exercise of the deception, the thrill of knowing the absolute truth about the town's secrets while presenting an image of harmless, grandmotherly benevolence. In her second interview with the state profilers, the librarian refused to use the names of the victims, referring to them instead by the filing numbers she had assigned them in her ledgers. When asked about Emily Vance, she simply stated that the girl had been an inevitable choice, an individual whose routine was so predictable that she represented a flaw in the town's behavioral design. She explained, without a trace of emotion, that she viewed her work as a form of social editing, removing those who did not contribute to the pristine, controlled aesthetic that she and the mayor had envisioned for Blackwood Creek. "The world thinks we took something away from the town," she said, her fingers tracing a pattern on the cold surface of the interrogation table. "But we gave them order. We gave them a mystery that kept them unified for 50 years. A town needs a ghost to stay vigilant. If Emily Vance hadn't vanished, they would have grown soft, careless, vulnerable to the real chaos of the outside world. We were the authors of their history, and history requires a sacrifice to be remembered." The publication of these interview transcripts, leaked through an anonymous source within the Justice Department, turned the public anger into something darker, a profound, collective dread. The town realized that they hadn't just been preyed upon by a killer, they had been subjected to a decades-long psychological experiment conducted by their own leaders. The local churches organized nightly vigils, not just for the victims, but for the soul of the town itself. The sanctuary of the First Methodist Church, the very building where the mayor had delivered the eulogy for Emily Vance during her memorial service in 1975, was filled to capacity every evening with people who sat in complete, terrified silence, listening to the winter wind howl against the stained glass windows. Detective Miller, working from his kitchen table in the neighboring state, watched the news broadcasts with a heavy, unyielding focus. He had spent his entire career chasing shadows, and now that the light had finally been thrown into the darkest corner of his past, he found that the reality was far more complex than any case file could contain. He knew that the trial would be a battle of attrition, a circus of legal technicalities that would test the endurance of the town and the families. He began to organize his personal notes, the journals he had kept during the early years of the investigation, preparing for the moment he would be called to testify. He knew that his testimony would be the bridge between the old world of 1974 and the forensic reality of 2026, a bridge that would carry the weight of a 50-year search for justice. The state's forensic team completed their initial analysis of the secondary cache from the library archives. The results were a devastating confirmation of the librarian's methodology. They found that she had systematically altered the town's historical records, removing old maps, census data, and property deeds that could have pointed future investigators toward the land holdings used by the Foundation. She had literally rewritten the geography of the county to obscure the infrastructure of the conspiracy. The library had not been a sanctuary of knowledge. It had been a manufacturing plant for a collective amnesia, a place where the past was curated and sanitized to protect the present safety of the monsters who ruled the town. As the date for the preliminary hearing approached, the state capitol prepared for a security operation of unprecedented scale. The county courthouse in Blackwood Creek was deemed too vulnerable to public disruption, prompting the trial to be moved to the high-security federal building in the city. The logistics of moving the defendants, protecting the witnesses, and managing the international press corps required the coordination of multiple state and federal agencies. The case had become more than just a local homicide. It was a test of the state's ability to prosecute institutional corruption at the highest level, a legal confrontation that would either validate the power of forensic science and accountability or reveal the terrifying durability of a well-engineered secret. The physical site off Route 9, where the concrete vault had first been broken, was now completely sealed under a layer of gravel and industrial asphalt, the expansion of the interstate moving forward despite the horror that had been unearthed beneath it. Cars sped over the spot at 70 miles an hour, their drivers unaware that they were passing over the exact location where a 50-year silence had been shattered. But for the people of Blackwood Creek, the road would always be a monument to the thaw. They knew what lay beneath the surface of their everyday lives. They knew that the ground could hold a secret for a lifetime, but that eventually, the earth always speaks, and when it does, it demands a reckoning that no amount of silence can ever turn away. The preliminary hearing in the state capitol did not open with the usual legal jargon or procedural delays. It began with the heavy, metallic sound of evidence boxes being stacked onto the prosecution tables. Dozens of them, each one labeled with a specific year, a specific decade, a specific life that had been carefully cataloged and filed away by the architects of Blackwood Creek's 50-year nightmare. The federal building was surrounded by 3 layers of steel barricades, with state tactical officers standing watch against a crowd that had grown to thousands. These weren't just true crime spectators. They were the living remnants of a betrayed community, people who had traveled through the freezing winter night just to see the former mayor and the librarian stripped of their masks of civic respectability. When the defendants were led into the courtroom, the atmosphere transformed into a vacuum of absolute, suffocating tension. The former mayor, Arthur Vance's political contemporary and once the undisputed patriarch of the valley, looked smaller in his standard-issue orange jumpsuit, yet his posture remained aggressively rigid. He did not look at the gallery, nor did he look at his co-conspirator. The librarian sat to his left, her silver hair pulled back into a severe, neat bun, her expression as calm and detached as if she were waiting for a library board meeting to order. It was this lack of visible fracture, this eerie preservation of their old public personas, that sent a chill through the packed courtroom. They looked like the people who had run the town, because they were. The prosecution's lead attorney, a specialist brought in from the Federal Civil Rights Division, didn't start with emotional appeal. He started with a technical breakdown of the architecture of erasure. He projected a 3-dimensional digital model of the public library basement onto the courtroom screens, revealing the structural modifications that had been hidden behind the historical archives for 45 years. The text on the slides was stark, detailing the installation of acoustic dampening panels, off-the-grid electrical conduits, and reinforced steel structural supports that had been paid for through the mayor's family foundation under the guise of building preservation. This enterprise did not operate in the shadows of the woods, the prosecutor stated, his voice echoing off the high stone walls of the courtroom. It operated in the light of the town square. It used the municipal budget, the public works department, and the institutional trust of the citizenry as its primary tools. The defendants built a fortress of impunity inside the very government they swore to protect, turning a small town into a private, highly regulated hunting ground. As the first witness took the stand, a forensic architect who had spent months analyzing the structural anomalies of the mayor's estate and the library, the true methodology of the double act became public record. The defense attorneys tried to disrupt the testimony with a barrage of objections regarding the chain of custody of the original blueprints from 1974, but the judge overruled them with a cold, decisive efficiency. The architect demonstrated how the subterranean chamber beneath the library had been connected to the old municipal steam tunnels, providing a completely invisible route between the civic center and the peripheral roads where the victims' vehicles had been staged or abandoned. This wasn't a series of random, chaotic homicides. It was an urban engineering project designed to maintain a permanent, managed level of terror without ever triggering a federal investigation. The prosecution then introduced the recovered ledgers, digital copies appearing on the monitors in a sequence that read like an industrial audit of human souls. The librarian's handwriting was displayed in high-resolution clarity, precise, elegant cursive detailing the behavioral patterns of Emily Vance in the weeks leading up to July 1974. The notes recorded the exact minute the girl crossed the intersection of Route 9, the frequency of the local police patrols, and the specific times when the surrounding fields were obscured by the heavy summer fog. It was a clinical execution plan, stripped of any emotion, written by the woman who had handed Emily her library books just days before she vanished. The courtroom remained in a state of stunned silence as the prosecution read from the mayor's typewritten addendums to those logs. His notes focused entirely on the post-incident management, how he had personally intervened to alter the shift schedules of the responding officers, how he had directed the local newspaper to downplay the possibility of a local suspect, and how he had used the Family Foundation to offer a reward that was designed to attract false leads and exhaust the investigative resources of the county. He had systematically poisoned the well of public information from day one, ensuring that the original search crews were always looking in the wrong direction, chasing ghosts that he and the librarian had manufactured. The cross-examination by the defense was a desperate attempt to shift the focus toward the limitations of the physical evidence. The mayor's high-priced defense attorney took the podium, his voice booming with theatrical skepticism as he pointed toward the 50-year gap in the DNA samples recovered from the interstate expansion site. He argued that the soil conditions, the presence of chemical fertilizers from the surrounding farms, and the modern excavation equipment had contaminated the biological markers, rendering the state's forensic profiles pseudoscientific guesswork. He attempted to paint his client as an aging public servant who was being scapegoated for the historical incompetence of a small-town police force that had simply lost control of its records. But the prosecution had anticipated the strategy. They called to the stand the state's chief forensic pathologist, a woman who had spent her career developing international standards for the exhumation of mass graves. She presented the chemical analysis of the concrete vault itself, demonstrating that the specialized industrial sealant used to encase the remains matched the exact batch orders purchased by the Municipal Public Works Department in October 1974, orders that had been personally authorized by the mayor's office under an emergency fund for bridge repair. The chemical signature was an unassailable link, a physical fingerprint that survived the decades because it had been protected from the elements by the very engineering designed to hide it. The dynamic between the two defendants during this testimony began to shift, providing the first glimpse of a fracture in their half-century partnership. As the pathologist detailed the precise construction of the vault, the former mayor's jaw tightened, his fingers tapping an erratic, nervous rhythm against the defense table. He glanced toward the librarian, his eyes filled with a hard, defensive calculation. The librarian, however, remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the forensic slides detailing the chemical compounds. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her lips, an expression that the state's psychological profilers, watching from the observation booth, recognized as a manifestation of profound intellectual arrogance. She wasn't horrified by the exposure. She was fascinated by the forensic reconstruction of her own design. In the afternoon session, the prosecution dropped a tactical bombshell that shifted the entire legal landscape of the case. They introduced a series of audio recordings discovered in a secondary safe within the librarian's home, tapes that had been recorded secretly during the late 1980s and early 1990s. The librarian had not trusted her political partner entirely. She had recorded their private planning sessions as a form of insurance, creating an audio archive of their conspiracy that survived long after the mayor had retired from public life. The sound of the mayor's voice filled the courtroom, stripped of its usual warm, electoral resonance, sounding dry, sharp, and chillingly pragmatic. On the tape, dated August 14, 1982, he could be heard discussing the disappearance of a young mechanic whose car had been found near the river. The county sheriff is asking too many questions about the acreage behind the old mill. The mayor's voice rasped through the courtroom speakers. I've told him we're looking into it as a municipal dump site, but we need to move the files from the library annex. If they look at the land registries from '74, the foundation's name is going to jump out. Clean the books, Martha. Make sure those files don't exist by Monday. The librarian's recorded response was calm, rhythmic, and terrifyingly supportive. The registries have already been misfiled, Arthur. They're sitting in the uncatalogued regional history section. No one is going to look for land deeds under 90-year-old tax assessments. Focus on the sheriff. Tell him there's a funding deficit for his patrol vehicles if he keeps spending resources on cold leads. The town wants this forgotten. Let them have what they want. The impact of the audio was devastating. The mayor's defense attorney sat down slowly, his face pale, his technical arguments about DNA contamination rendered entirely irrelevant by his client's own recorded voice detailing the obstruction of justice. In the gallery, the families of the victims wept openly, their hands clenched together as they heard the cold, administrative calculation that had kept their loved ones hidden for generations. The betrayal was no longer a theory or a collection of old files. It was a living, breathing voice that had ruled their town with absolute authority. Outside the courthouse, as the news of the audio leaks spread through the crowd via mobile networks, the atmosphere turned volatile. The chant for immediate justice rose in volume, a rhythmic, deep roar that could be felt through the concrete floors of the federal building. The local authorities had to call in additional state police units to maintain the perimeter, the city realizing that the Oakhaven case was no longer just a legal proceeding. It was a cultural crisis that was threatening to boil over into civil unrest if the mechanism of the court appeared to falter. The judge, recognizing the gravity of the moment, denied bail for both defendants with a swift, absolute strike of her gavel, ordering them held in permanent, isolated federal custody until the formal trial date. As the marshal stepped forward to lead the suspects away, the mayor appeared to sag, the weight of his own recorded words finally breaking the spine of his aristocratic arrogance. He walked out with a slow, stumbling gait, an old man who had realized that his empire of silence had collapsed entirely. The librarian, however, stood up with her usual precision, smoothed the front of her jumpsuit, and walked out with her head held high, looking back at the gallery one last time with an expression of cold, unblinking defiance. Detective Miller, watching the live text updates from his kitchen table 3 states away, let out a breath he felt he had been holding since 1974. He looked at the old, yellowed notebook sitting next to his laptop, the original file from the day Emily Vance's bicycle had been found spinning in the ditch. The names of the suspects weren't written in those early pages. He had spent decades looking for a phantom in the woods, a drifter who didn't exist. He realized that the success of the task force was a validation of his life's work, but it was also a grim reminder of how easily a community can be blinded by its own desire for respectability. The cold case had been shattered. The double arrest had rocked the town, but the reconstruction of Blackwood Creek was a labor that would take generations, a task that would begin only when the final verdict was written into the history of the state. The shockwave from the audio tapes didn't just smash through the defense's legal strategy. It initiated an institutional purge that systematically dismantled the surviving power structures of Blackwood Creek. By the time the sun set on the 3rd day of the preliminary hearings, the state governor had signed an extraordinary executive order suspending the entire municipal charter of the town. A state-appointed receiver was dispatched to take control of the civic records, the public works department, and the local police archives. The town square, once a symbol of idyllic Americana, was transformed into an administrative fortress. White State Police Command trailers parked directly on the manicured lawns where the mayor had once given his annual 4th of July speeches, their diesel generators humming a low, aggressive bass line that kept the entire valley awake through the freezing winter nights. Detective Miller spent those nights staring at the digitized transcripts of the secret recordings. The state task force had sent him the audio files under a strict non-disclosure agreement, recognizing that his institutional memory was the only key capable of deciphering the cryptic references hidden within the suspect's conversations. As he listened to the dry, pragmatic rhythm of the librarian's voice, Miller realized that her filing system was far more extensive than a collection of physical binders. She had operated as a biological database, using her position to run a continuous, analog surveillance operation on 3 generations of families. She knew who had debt. She knew who had health crises. She knew which parents were too exhausted by the daily grind of survival to notice the quiet, systematic grooming of their children. In his personal log, Miller began mapping what he termed the symbiotic shadow. He noted that traditional profiling metrics failed completely when applied to the mayor and the librarian because they lacked the chaotic, impulsive markers of individual predators. They operated with the cold, administrative logic of a regulatory agency. The mayor provided the legal shielding, the infrastructure funding, and the executive authority to bury complaints, while the librarian provided the analytical intelligence, the target acquisition, and the data management. Together, they had turned the public institutions of Blackwood Creek into a closed-loop system designed to harvest human lives while maintaining an absolute appearance of civic equilibrium. The forensic excavation of the library annex moved into its 3rd week, turning the historic stone building into a hollowed-out shell. Technicians using ground-penetrating radar discovered that the concrete modifications in the basement didn't stop at the municipal steam tunnels. They extended into a secondary, reinforced vault that had been constructed directly beneath the children's reading room. The structural blueprints filed with the county in 1981 had listed the space as a foundational stabilization grid, a technical lie that had allowed the mayor's construction company to pour tons of high-grade industrial concrete without triggering an inspection. When the forensics teams breached the 3-inch steel door hidden behind a false masonry wall, the interior air hit them with a scent of lime, ozone, and decades of absolute isolation. Inside this secondary vault, the investigators found the operational core of the librarian's intelligence network. The room was lined with temperature-controlled steel lockers, each one containing an absolute, exhaustive history of a specific target. There were school report cards, medical dental records, stolen articles of clothing, and hundreds of cassette tapes containing ambient recordings of families in their own homes. The librarian had utilized a network of primitive, hardwired listening devices that had been installed during a municipal program to upgrade the town's telephone and electrical infrastructure in the late 70s. The very cables that brought power and communication to the residents had been weaponized to export their private lives into her private archive. The lead investigator of the state task force stood in the center of the vault, his face illuminated by the harsh, white light of a forensic lamp. He held a plastic evidence bag containing a small, hand-knitted blue mitten, the exact mitten that 6-year-old Tommy Vance had been wearing when he slipped out of his backyard on a snowy afternoon in January 1979. For 47 years, his disappearance had been classified as a tragic drowning, the assumption being that he had wandered onto the frozen creek and fallen through the ice. The discovery of his mitten within the librarian's secure locker shattered that narrative completely, turning a historical accident into a calculated abduction. The implication was staggering. The enterprise hadn't just targeted adolescents and drifters. They had curated a multi-generational gallery of the town's children, operating with an impunity that extended over nearly half a century. The public reaction in the valley crossed the threshold from anger into an absolute, catatonic despair. The realization that their homes had been wired for sound, that their local history had been manipulated, and that their children had been studied like laboratory animals broke the psychological back of the community. The local real estate market collapsed overnight. Families packed up whatever could fit into their cars and abandoned their homes, leaving the lights on and the front doors unlocked, fleeing the valley as if it were a zone of nuclear contamination. The businesses along Main Street boarded up their windows, not out of fear of riots, but because there was no longer an economy to sustain them. The town was dying from the inside out, poisoned by the revelation that its existence had been an engineered illusion. In the high-security wing of the Capitol Correctional Facility, the psychological warfare between the state prosecutors and the former mayor reached a critical escalation point. Denied his corporate lawyers and stripped of his financial insulation, the mayor's health had begun to decline with rapid, visible precision. He sat in the interrogation room, his hands trembling as he clutched a paper cup of water, his eyes darting toward the security cameras with a nervous, hyper-vigilant intensity. The state had presented him with a financial audit of his foundation, demonstrating that every single dollar used to build the subterranean vaults had been tracked back to federal infrastructure grants, a paper trail that carried an automatic, non-parolable federal prison sentence for public corruption and conspiracy. The prosecutor leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a hard, clinical whisper. Your co-conspirator isn't breaking, Arthur. She's sitting in her cell writing a historical manuscript. She looks at you as an instrument, a logistical asset that she used to execute her vision. She's already admitted to the handwriting in the ledgers. She's already validated the authenticity of the audio recordings. She doesn't care about the prison sentence because she believes her design has already achieved permanence. But you care. You want to see the sun again. Give us the remaining locations, Arthur. Give us the names of the people who helped you pour the concrete in 74. The mayor's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The aristocratic arrogance that had defined his public life for 50 years had evaporated, leaving behind the hollow, terrified frame of an old man who had realized that his empire of silence had become his tomb. He looked down at the table, a single tear cutting a clean path through the gray dust on his cheek. He knew that if he spoke, he would seal his own damnation in the eyes of history, but he also knew that if he remained silent, the librarian would control the final narrative, relegating him to a footnote in the monstrous saga she had authored. The legal teams for the defense attempted a final, desperate maneuver to halt the proceedings, filing a motion for a total change of venue to a federal court outside the state, arguing that the continuous leaks of the audio recordings and the forensic data had created a toxic media environment that rendered a fair trial impossible anywhere within 500 miles of Blackwood Creek. They produced psychological surveys indicating that 98% of the local population held a fixed, immovable belief in the defendant's guilt. The motion was an attempt to delay the inevitable, a tactical retreat designed to drag the process into the following year and exhaust the state's financial resources. But the federal judge was unyielding. In a blistering 20-page opinion issued from her chambers, she denied the change of venue, stating that the unique, institutional nature of the crimes demanded that the adjudication occur within the jurisdiction that had been victimized. The defendants did not commit a crime against an individual, the judge wrote. They committed a crime against the very concept of civic society. They subverted the courts, the police, and the public records to manufacture an artificial reality. The restoration of that reality cannot occur in a distant courtroom. The truth must be spoken in the very valley where the silence was enforced. As the winter ice began to crack under the first, tentative warmth of an early February thaw, the state task force completed its digital reconstruction of the Enterprise's operational matrix. The data was compiled into a single, comprehensive report that was delivered directly to the Attorney General's desk. The document, titled the Blackwood Creek Institutional Forensic Audit, demonstrated that the mayor and the librarian had successfully avoided detection not because they were exceptionally clever, but because they had exploited a fundamental vulnerability in modern law enforcement: the absolute reliance on compartmentalized data. Because the disappearances had occurred across 3 separate counties and over a 50-year span, the individual police departments had treated each case as an isolated, local event, never looking at the common denominator that sat in the front row of every regional planning meeting. The report also revealed a darker, more insidious detail. The suspects had utilized a network of retired public works employees, men who had been dependent on the mayor's company for their pensions, to perform the specialized concrete injections and structural sealing projects that had kept the vaults hidden from routine maintenance crews. These individuals hadn't necessarily known that they were constructing graves. They had been told that they were building classified civil defense shelters during the height of the Cold War anxiety in the mid-70s. The mayor had weaponized their loyalty and their patriotism, converting an entire generation of working-class men into unwitting accomplices in his campaign of terror. Detective Miller stood up from his kitchen table, stretched his aching back, and walked out onto his porch. The morning air was sharp, smelling of wet earth and melting frost. He looked toward the eastern horizon, toward the distant valley where Blackwood Creek lay paralyzed under the weight of its own history. He knew that the formal trial, scheduled to begin in less than a month, would be a brutal, agonizing process of public dissection. The defense would challenge every DNA marker, every audio tape, and every page of the librarian's cursive logs. But Miller also knew that the circuit had been broken permanently. The earth had given up its secrets, the vaults had been emptied, and the voices of the dead were finally louder than the silence that had tried to erase them. The 1970s cold case had been shattered, the double arrest had rocked the state, and the long, freezing winter of Blackwood Creek was finally turning toward an absolute, unforgiving spring. The transition from the preliminary hearings to the formal trial of the century was marked by an unnatural, suffocating stillness that settled over the capital city. The federal courthouse, a monolithic structure of gray granite and reinforced glass, was transformed into an active tactical zone. Snipers from the state police hovered on the rooftops, their scopes trained on the perimeter streets below, while canine units swept the structural foundations every 3 hours for explosive devices. The public fury had evolved into a cold, organized demand for absolute retribution. The International Media Corps had constructed a massive, multi-tiered satellite village in the plaza, their Klieg lights burning through the thick winter smog, turning the courthouse into a permanent, surreal stage where the collective sins of an entire generation were about to be systematically laid bare. Inside the courtroom, the spatial arrangement itself reflected the brutal reality of the case. The prosecution table was a mountain of organized data, hard drives, forensic charts, and plastic-wrapped physical artifacts that formed a physical wall between the state and the defense. The former mayor sat on the right side of the defense table, his physical decline now absolute. His skin had taken on a translucent, waxy quality, his breathing assisted by a low-profile oxygen concentrator that clicked with a rhythmic, mechanical hiss. To his left sat the librarian, completely unaltered by her months in solitary confinement. Her hands rested flat on the polished wood, her posture as elegant and precise as it had been when she presided over the Regional Historical Society. The silence between the two co-conspirators was absolute. They did not look at each other, nor did they acknowledge the presence of the victims' families who occupied the first 5 rows of the gallery. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered not by a local district attorney, but by the federal prosecutor who had spearheaded the racketeering charge. He walked to the center of the well, his movements slow, his eyes fixed entirely on the jury, 12 ordinary citizens who had been sequestered for weeks, their identities protected by federal anonymity orders. He didn't use rhetoric, he used chronology. He began by projecting a single photograph from July 1974, the front wheel of Emily Vance's bicycle, caked in dried mud, sitting in the evidence locker of the old Blackwood Creek precinct. For 52 years, the document you are looking at was classified as a mystery, the prosecutor began, his voice dropping to a low resonance that filled the room. The town was told that a predator had drifted into their valley from the outside world, committed an act of unspeakable violence, and vanished into the ether. But the truth is far more terrifying. The monster didn't arrive from the highway. The monster was already sitting in the mayor's office. The monster was checking out books to children in the town library. What we are presenting to you over the next month is not a story of random violence, but a chronicle of civil engineering. The defendants built a municipality around their own appetite, converting the legal, financial, and physical infrastructure of a small town into a permanent, highly regulated facility for human erasure. The prosecution's first witness was the state's lead forensic digital analyst, a specialist who had spent 6 months deconstructing the hard drives and encryption keys recovered from the librarian's residence. He presented a visual mapping of what the investigation termed the curation protocol. Using a highly advanced data visualization program, he demonstrated how the librarian had converted the public library's digital cataloging system into a localized intelligence matrix. When a family checked out specific genres of books, particularly those related to travel, relocation, or survival, the librarian system automatically flagged their account, initiating a deeper, off-the-books investigation into their domestic stability. The analyst brought up a specific log file from October 1994, detailing the surveillance of a young family that had recently moved to Blackwood Creek from Chicago. The notes, entered in the librarian's precise shorthand, recorded the father's employment status, the mother's daily commute times, and the exact window when their 8-year-old son was left unattended at the local playground. The digital evidence was unassailable. It showed that the librarian had been using the library's administrative software to track the vulnerabilities of the population in real time, functioning as a human panopticon disguised as a public servant. The defense's counterstrategy during the cross-examination was an aggressive, technical assault on the integrity of the digital forensics. The mayor's primary counsel, a veteran of federal conspiracy trials, took the podium with a posture of theatrical skepticism. He focused entirely on the metadata of the files, arguing that the dates of creation and modification could have been corrupted during the state's mass extraction process. He suggested that the logs were not a real-time record of stalkings, but rather the notes of an eccentric, amateur historian who was obsessed with compiling data on the town's residents, a bizarre hobby, perhaps, but one that fell far short of proving a conspiracy to commit murder. You are asking this jury to look at strings of numbers and data blocks and conclude that a public official signed a death warrant, the defense attorney shouted, pointing an accusing finger at the analyst. Can you state, under oath, with absolute scientific certainty, that these files were not modified by a third party after the suspects were taken into custody? Can you prove that this data was not manipulated by an overzealous task force desperate to close 5 decades of unsolved cold cases? The analyst did not blink. He brought up a secondary screen showing the cryptographic hash values of the files, demonstrating that each entry had been secured with a unique digital signature that matched the librarian's personal administrative token, a token that had been active only within the library's local network long before the arrest occurred. The link was unbroken. The data had been locked by the librarian's own hands, preserved by her own desire to keep her records pristine. The trial moved into its second week with the testimony of the retired public works personnel, the men who had been paid through the mayor's foundation to pour the concrete vaults beneath the interstate expansion site and the library annex. One by one, these men, now in their late 70s and early 80s, took the stand, their faces etched with a profound, crushing sense of shame. They described a system of manipulation that had weaponized their financial dependency and their trust in authority. A former concrete mixer foreman, his voice trembling as he clutched the edge of the witness box, described the specific night in October 1974 when he was ordered to divert 3 trucks of high-grade commercial cement to an isolated section of the Miller farm. He testified that the mayor had personally stood at the site, wearing a hard hat, directing the pour into a pre-excavated trench that had been reinforced with heavy steel rebar. He told us it was a classified communications bunker for the Civil Defense Network. The old man wept, his chest heaving with emotion. He said the government needed it done in total secrecy because of the tensions with the Soviets. He paid us double time out of the foundation's cash account. We trusted him. He was the mayor. We thought we were serving our country. We didn't know we were pouring a tomb over a little girl. The gallery fell into a state of numb, vibrating horror as the old man's words echoed through the courtroom. The projection screens behind him displayed the physical excavation photos, showing the exact layers of cement he had described, the structural markers matching the precise batch orders he had signed 52 years prior. The defense tried to object, claiming that the witness's memory was tainted by age and the sensationalized news coverage, but the physical reality of the concrete itself, analyzed by chemical engineers and mapped by radar, rendered their objections hollow. The true climax of the trial's emotional weight came on the 15th day, when the prosecution introduced the physical trophies recovered from the library's hidden vault. The items were brought into the well of the court in sealed, transparent display cases, looking like a collection of haunted artifacts from a lost era. There was a rusted metal watch, its hands frozen at 4:12, a faded denim jacket with a high school sports patch, a child's plastic hair clip, and the hand-knitted blue mitten belonging to Tommy Vance. The prosecutor did not call a witness immediately. He allowed the display cases to sit in the center of the room in absolute silence for 5 full minutes. The only sound was the low, steady hiss of the mayor's oxygen machine. The visual impact was devastating. These weren't abstract data blocks or forensic profiles. These were the tangible remnants of lives that had been violently interrupted, preserved in dust and spite inside a public building for half a century. When the state's chief medical examiner took the stand, she used a laser pointer to connect the physical markings on the trophies to the skeletal trauma discovered within the concrete vault. She demonstrated that the victims had not been subjected to chaotic, random violence. Their deaths had been caused by an identical, clinical method of asphyxiation that left no outward signs of struggle on the skeletal framework. This was the work of someone who understood human anatomy, someone who operated without panic, someone who treated the act of termination as a routine, mechanical process. As the medical examiner detailed the structural damage to the remains of the young drifter discovered alongside Emily Vance, the librarian leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the digital X-rays projected on the screens. She pulled a notepad toward her and began taking rapid, energetic notes, her expression intense and analytical. The state psychologists watching from the gallery noted that she wasn't showing signs of distress. She was engaging with the forensic analysis, as if it were an academic review of her own life's work. She was validating her own precision through the testimony of the state's highest experts. The defense's attempt to mount a case for the former mayor began to dissolve before it could even be formally introduced. Their medical experts, brought in to argue that the mayor's advanced dementia and respiratory failure rendered him unfit to stand trial or comprehend the charges, were systematically dismantled by the prosecution's cross-examination. The state introduced internal memos and financial letters signed by the mayor just 6 months prior to his arrest, documents that showed sharp, calculating mind that was actively managing millions of dollars in real estate assets and corporate holdings. He wasn't incompetent. He was hiding behind the frailty of his own body, attempting to use the natural progression of age as his final, legal shield. The atmosphere outside the federal building had reached a critical mass. The crowds had grown to encompass entire generations of families from the surrounding counties, their numbers stretching down the blocks and into the public parks. They held silent vigils, lighting thousands of candles that cast a flickering, amber glow against the granite walls of the courthouse. The case had broken the psychological dam of the entire region. It was no longer just about the town of Blackwood Creek. It was a national reckoning with the terrifying vulnerability of our own civic institutions. Inside his secluded residence 3 states away, Detective Miller sat at his desk, his telephone ringing continuously, his email inbox flooding with alerts from the task force. He didn't answer. He was looking at an old, leather-bound map of Blackwood Creek from 1974, the streets marked with his own handwritten notes from the early days of the search. He remembered the face of Emily Vance's mother, a woman who had died in 1989 without ever knowing that the man who held her hand at her daughter's memorial service was the architect of her destruction. Miller felt a profound, heavy sorrow that defied the legal success of the trial. He understood that while the court could deliver a verdict, it could never restore the balance of what had been stolen. The law was an instrument of accountability, but it was not an instrument of resurrection. The prosecution officially rested its case on the 22nd day of testimony, leaving behind a narrative of institutional corruption and calculated horror that was unparalleled in the history of the state. The defense was given 48 hours to prepare their final arguments, a window that many assumed would be used to negotiate a last-minute plea deal for the mayor to avoid a federal death sentence. But as the winter wind rattled the heavy glass windows of the Capitol building, casting long, distorted shadows across the empty well of the court, one thing was certain. The architecture of the silence had been demolished permanently. The 1970s cold case had been shattered. The double arrest had broken the spine of a multi-decade deception, and the town of Blackwood Creek was finally, irrevocably, standing in the light of an absolute and unforgiving truth. The 48-hour window granted to the defense did not bring the anticipated announcement of a negotiated plea agreement. Instead, it brought a tactical maneuver that completely upended the expectations of the legal community and the waiting public. When the courtroom opened for the defense's formal presentation, The former mayor's primary counsel stood before the bench and announced that his client would waive his right to remain silent. The absolute silence that followed his words was punctuated only by the mechanical, rhythmic hiss of the old man's oxygen concentrator. The prosecution team leaned forward as one, their faces hardening into masks of pure, defensive concentration. They had built an unassailable fortress of forensic data, but the living voice of a ghost from 1974 was a wild card that no digital matrix could fully predict. Arthur sat in the witness chair, his frail frame swallowed by the oversized leather seat. His hands, caked in liver spots and trembling with the fatigue of advanced age, clutched the edges of the wooden armrests as if he were trying to anchor himself to the physical reality of the courtroom. When he spoke, his voice was not the booming, resonant instrument that had dominated the town's political landscapes for 3 decades. It was a dry, scraping whisper that sounded like dead leaves being dragged across raw concrete. Yet, there was no tremor of confusion in his words, no evidence of the cognitive decline his lawyers had tried to claim as a shield. His mind was a steel trap, preserved in ice, holding the exact coordinates of every decision he had made over a 50-year span. "We did not create the darkness in Blackwood Creek," Arthur whispered, his eyes scanning the jury with a slow, calculating intensity that made several members visibly shift in their seats. "We merely managed it. When I took office in 1972, the valley was transitioning from an isolated agricultural hub into a modern suburb. Growth brings chaos. It brings drifters, transients, runaways, people who exist on the margins of society, people who leave no ripple when they disappear. My family had built that town. Our name was on the banks, the roads, the public works. I viewed it as my administrative duty to ensure that the friction of this expansion did not destroy the stable, pristine environment that our citizens required to raise their families." The defense attorney guided him through a chronological defense that sought to frame his actions not as a series of brutal homicides, but as a system of extreme, calculated utilitarianism. Arthur described the selection of the Miller Farm property as an emergency infrastructure decision. He explained that during the height of the Cold War anxieties, the federal government had provided millions of dollars in civil defense grants to create localized survival shelters. He had used his construction company to execute those grants, building the subterranean vaults with the intention of creating a secure, off-the-grid command network for the town's leadership. The space was built to survive an apocalypse, the former mayor continued, his breathing tightening as he paused to adjust the oxygen mask against his face. But as the years went on, the space became useful for a different kind of containment. The librarian, Martha, was the one who realized that a community cannot maintain its moral equilibrium without a baseline of vigilance. When Emily Vance vanished in July 1974, the town didn't fall apart. It unified. Neighbors started locking their doors. Parents started watching their children. The police department received funding upgrades that allowed us to clean up the petty crime, the vagrancy, and the drug trafficking that was beginning to seep in from the highway. The mystery of the cold case became the psychological anchor that kept Blackwood Creek safe for a generation. The cross-examination by the federal prosecutor was a masterclass in psychological demolition. He did not approach the witness with anger. He approached him with the clinical detachment of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent ledger. He walked to the center of the well, holding a high-resolution print of the leather-bound diary recovered from the library's secondary vault. "You speak of administrative duty and communal stability, Arthur," the prosecutor said, his voice dropping to a hard, level tone that cut through the mechanical hum of the oxygen machine. "But let us look at the actual protocol. On August 14, 1982, you recorded the surveillance of a 19-year-old mechanic who had recently moved to the area. Your notes don't mention town safety. They detail his physical height, his work schedule, and the exact volume of concrete required to seal the secondary partition of the cellar. Is it your testimony to this jury that the execution of an innocent teenager was necessary to maintain the property values of Blackwood Creek?" Arthur's eyes narrowed, the waxy skin around his jaw tightening until his veins looked like blue threads against his skull. The individual in question was a transient with a history of vagrancy in 3 separate states, he rasped, his voice rising slightly in pitch. He had no family, no roots, no economic contribution to the valley. His presence was a friction point in the neighborhood. When he vanished, the investigation redirected the local youth away from the drag racing tracks near the old mill. We used the incident to enforce a curfew that reduced property crimes by 40% in the subsequent quarter. You look at the individual lives, I looked at the architecture of the whole. A leader must be willing to make the structural adjustments that ordinary citizens do not have the stomach to contemplate. The raw, unadorned arrogance of his response sent a wave of low, vibrating horror through the gallery. It was the confirmation that the town's highest authority had viewed them not as a constituency to be protected, but as an ecosystem to be managed through selective culling. The prosecutor did not press him further on that point. He had allowed the former mayor to hang himself with his own philosophy. He turned toward the defense table, pointing a finger at the librarian, who had remained perfectly still throughout her co-conspirator's testimony. "And what of Martha?" the prosecutor asked. "Did she share this administrative vision, or was she simply the data architect who kept the filing system running?" Arthur glanced toward the librarian, a flash of ancient, bitter resentment cutting through his stone mask. "Martha didn't care about the town," he whispered, his voice dropping back to a raspy hiss. "She cared about the data. She was a scientist mapping a closed environment. I provided the legal insulation and the physical infrastructure, but she was the one who kept the files. She recorded the details because she wanted to see if her predictions were correct. She viewed the citizens of Blackwood Creek as specimens in a jar. If I hadn't managed the logistical side, she would have exposed the entire operation decades ago simply to see how the public would react to the data. She was the true engine of the design. I was merely the builder who ensured the walls didn't cave in." The librarian did not flinch at the accusation. She adjusted her glasses with a slow, deliberate movement of her hand, her eyes locked on the former mayor with an expression that was chillingly clinical, the look of a researcher observing a laboratory subject that had outlived its usefulness. She did not request to testify in her own defense. She had already allowed her handwritten logs and her secret audio recordings to speak for her. To her, the trial was not a moral reckoning. It was the final, public publication of a highly successful, 50-year intellectual project. The defense officially rested its case following the mayor's testimony, leaving the courtroom in a state of suspended animation as the judge outlined the instructions for the closing arguments. The public reaction outside the federal building had evolved from chaotic protests into a massive, silent vigil that occupied 3 city blocks. Thousands of people stood in the freezing winter slush, their faces illuminated by the pale light of their mobile devices as they read the live transcripts of the mayor's confession. The sense of violation was now total. The defense had not offered a denial, but an ideological justification that turned the very concept of local government into an instrument of terror. In his secluded home, Detective Miller sat in the dark, the sound of the trial's audio feed echoing from his computer speakers. He looked at the original 1974 file folder, its edges frayed and yellowed by time. He remembered the long, exhausting nights he had spent driving Route 9, searching the woods for a drifter, checking the registrations of out-of-state vehicles, completely blind to the fact that the architecture of the crime was being managed from the elegant colonial house on the hill. He felt a profound, exhausting sense of failure that defied the legal success of the prosecution. He had spent his entire adult life tracking a shadow, only to find that the shadow had been cast by the very institutions he had sworn to serve. The final day of the trial opened with the prosecution's closing argument, a performance that would be studied by legal historians for decades. The federal prosecutor did not use visual charts or digital slides this time. He stood in the center of the well, his hands empty, his focus entirely on the 12 jurors who had carried the weight of the evidence for a month. This case has been described as a cold case that was solved by a stroke of luck, an accidental strike by a construction crew, the prosecutor said, his voice ringing with a hard, clear resonance against the granite walls. But what you have seen over the past 4 weeks is not a mystery that went cold due to a lack of evidence. It was an operation that was kept frozen by design. The defendants used the trust of a community as their primary camouflage. They used the police badge, the municipal contract, and the public library to manufacture a 50-year silence. They ask you to believe that they created order, that they kept Blackwood Creek safe. But a safety that requires the burial of children beneath concrete is not order. It is a fortress of terror. The true restoration of that town begins today, not with a structural adjustment, but with a verdict of absolute, uncompromised accountability. The jury's deliberation was remarkably swift, lasting less than 4 hours, a testament to the devastating clarity of the forensic evidence and the suspect's own recorded words. When the court was called back into session at 4:15 p.m., the atmosphere inside the room was so thick with tension that the only audible sound was the erratic, rapid clicking of the mayor's oxygen machine. The foreperson, a schoolteacher from an adjacent county, stood up, her hands trembling slightly as she held the verdict sheet. She looked directly at the defendants as she read the findings into the record. Guilty on all counts of racketeering conspiracy, institutional corruption, civil rights violations, and multiple counts of first-degree murder. The string of life sentences that followed was a mathematical abstraction, an eternity behind bars that could never truly balance the scales of the lives that had been extinguished beneath the soil of Route 9. As the judge brought down her gavel, signaling the absolute closure of the legal proceeding, the former mayor collapsed forward onto the defense table, his oxygen mask slipping from his face as his body finally succumbed to the weight of his own damnation. The medical personnel swarmed the table, their white coats a frantic blur against the dark wood, but the librarian remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching the resuscitation efforts with the same detached, clinical curiosity that had characterized her entire life. She was led away in chains a few minutes later, her head held high, her expression unblinking as she stepped out of the light of the courtroom and into the permanent shadow of a federal penitentiary. The aftermath of the trial left Blackwood Creek a ghost town in the most literal sense. The state receiver's institutional purge resulted in the demolition of the library annex and the systematic clearing of the mayor's colonial estate, the land turned over to a state park trust that would ensure the properties remained wild, undeveloped monuments to the lives that had been lost. The residents who stayed behind formed a community that was defined by its resilience, but also by an unyielding, generational vigilance. They had learned the hardest lesson a society can endure, that the greatest danger does not always wear the mask of an outsider. Sometimes it lives right next door, mows its lawn with clockwork precision, waves at your children, and uses the very machinery of your safety to build its own private empire of the dark. The 1970s cold case had been shattered, the double arrest had rocked the nation, and the valley was finally left to begin the long, slow process of thawing out beneath the cold and unforgiving light of the truth. The formal closing of the trial didn't act as a clean, definitive end to the nightmare of Blackwood Creek. It acted as the demolition of a dam, allowing 5 decades of pent-up trauma to flood the valley with a toxic, unyielding force. While the international media crews packed up their equipment and moved on to the next sensationalized headline, the state-appointed receiver and his team of forensic investigators moved back into the town with a grim, total finality. They weren't looking for headlines anymore. They were doing the hard, bureaucratic work of auditing an entire municipality's history. Every property deed signed during the mayor's tenure, every municipal land acquisition, and every historical file that had passed through the librarian's hands was subjected to a cold, scientific review under the glare of mobile laboratory lights. Detective Miller, sitting in the deep silence of his out-of-state study, found that the verdict had brought him no sense of relief. The old, yellowed file folder labeled Vance, Emily, 1974 still sat on his desk, its presence an accusation. He had spent his entire career operating under the assumption that the world was divided into clear, distinct territories of light and dark, that the law was a shield and the criminal was an intruder who breached the perimeter of a safe society. The trial had destroyed that philosophy completely. The revelation that the fortress of the law had been converted into a factory of erasure by the very people who held the keys was a psychological trauma that no courtroom victory could ever cure. He began writing a final analytical report, not for the police academy or the state archives, but for the descendants of the community, a document detailing the specific structural vulnerabilities that allowed an administrative conspiracy to achieve a half-century of impunity. He noted that the enterprise's primary weapon had been the exploitation of institutional trust and data compartmentalization. In the 70s and 80s, before the advent of centralized, digital databases, law enforcement operated as a network of isolated fiefdoms. A disappearance in one county was treated as a local anomaly, completely disconnected from a similar incident 30 miles away. Arthur and Martha had understood this flaw perfectly. By ensuring that their targets were selected from transient populations or families that lacked deep social capital in the valley, and by distributing the incidents across different jurisdictions over a massive timeline, they had managed to keep the statistical markers below the threshold that would trigger a federal pattern investigation. They had weaponized the bureaucratic inefficiency of the system to protect their private hunting ground. In Blackwood Creek itself, the physical reality of the town was being systematically erased. The state receiver authorized the absolute demolition of the library annex, a structural extraction that turned the historic stone building into a hollowed-out monument to a collective betrayal. The construction crews moved with a silent, somber efficiency, utilizing heavy machinery to tear down the walls that had hidden the librarian's secondary vault for 45 years. The debris was not recycled or moved to a local landfill. It was transported under state police escort to an industrial processing facility 3 hours north, where it was crushed into unrecognizable gravel and mixed with asphalt, a literal burying of the physical infrastructure of the crime beneath the state's highway system. The vacant lot where the mayor's colonial estate had stood remained fenced off with high, chain-link barriers topped with razor wire. The ground, caked in the gray dust of the demolition, refused to grow even the most aggressive winter weeds. It sat like an open, cauterized wound on the hill overlooking the valley, a visual reminder that the town's history had been built on a foundation of calculated violence. The residents who had chosen to remain in the area avoided the street entirely, their driving routes altered to ensure they never had to look at the spot where the 50-year silence had been orchestrated. The neighborhood had taken on the characteristics of an exclusion zone, a place where the air felt permanently thin, heavy with the phantom weight of the secrets that had been exhaled from the soil. The psychological impact on the surviving generations began to manifest in a deep, institutional paralysis. The local school board, the town council, and the voluntary civic organizations had completely dissolved, their functions absorbed by state agencies that operated with a sterile, mechanical distance. The collective trust that acts as the glue for a community had been entirely liquidated. Parents who had grown up under the librarian's benevolent gaze looked at their own memories with a sense of profound, sickening vertigo. Every book recommendation, every after-school reading program, and every encouraging word she had spoken to their children was now viewed as a tactical reconnaissance operation designed to assess their vulnerability. The realization that their safety had been a managed illusion turned their daily routines into a series of anxious, hypervigilant calculations. Inside the high-security ward of the state prison hospital, the former mayor's final days were documented with a clinical, bureaucratic coldness that mirrored his own logs. Following his collapse at the defense table, his body had entered a state of rapid, irreversible failure. He lay in a sterile, white room, his movements monitored by 2 corrections officers who sat in the corner in complete silence, their expressions indifferent to the passing of a man who had once ruled a valley with absolute authority. He no longer spoke of administrative duty or the architecture of order. His final, raspy whispers were a chaotic stream of names, dates, and technical measurements, the language of a builder who realized that his foundations had completely crumbled beneath him. He died at 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, his passing marked only by a single line in the prison's administrative logbook. There was no funeral, no public notice, and his remains were claimed by no one, buried in a nameless plot within the correctional facility's perimeter. The librarian, however, remained completely insulated from the physical and moral collapse of her partner. Housed in a federal penitentiary for women, she adapted to her new environment with a chilling, clockwork precision. She volunteered for work in the prison library within her first week, her behavior so exemplary that the corrections staff found it difficult to reconcile the polite, silver-haired woman with the monstrous logs that had been read into the court record. She spent her evenings writing a massive, cross-referenced manuscript that she referred to as a sociological audit of a closed community. She didn't seek publication or legal relief. She was continuing her life's work, analyzing the behavioral responses of the prison population with the same detached, clinical curiosity she had trained on the citizens of Blackwood Creek for 50 years. To her, the prison cell was not a punishment, but a new laboratory, a more controlled environment where her methodology could be refined without the logistical complications of the outside world. As the winter ice finally gave way to the sharp, clear light of an early spring thaw, the state task force released its final, comprehensive report on the Oakhaven conspiracy. The document, running over 3,000 pages, was a devastating indictment of 50 years of systemic oversight. It detailed not only the crimes of the two principal suspects, but also the secondary layer of complicity that had allowed the operation to endure. The report demonstrated that several key figures in the county's historical legal apparatus had systematically ignored anomalies in the missing persons data out of a desire to protect the region's reputation for safety and economic stability. They hadn't been active participants in the murders, but their professional apathy and their willingness to accept easy, convenient answers had acted as the protective atmosphere within which the monster had thrived. The publication of the report initiated a second wave of institutional restructuring across the state. The Miller Protocol was codified into state law, mandating a centralized, cross-jurisdictional